Hey guys, it's Mrs. Ciccone here, checking in, and I wanted to share a little bit of details about what is ecological succession. That's one of our topics for this week. So if you check out, there are a few examples of disturbances that can cause ecological succession. So ecological succession is the process of an ecological community recovering after a disturbance. So the living things that live there and the abiotic components, remember when we talk about abiotic, we're talking about the non-living components like water, soil, the stones, even the climate like the temperature, precipitation. There are two types of succession that we are concerned with: primary succession and secondary succession. So one classic example that we can look at of primary succession is Mount St. Helens, which is a volcano that erupted in 1980. And if you look here, this image right here is the before, and this is the after. This kind of shows the outline of the original mountain. So it just kind of, that with the way that it erupted, it just totally decimated that mountain. It totally wiped out all of the trees, and it took a long time for life to start to come back. It is starting to flourish and it is starting to come back, but initially it was just completely desolate. So when we talk about primary succession, it can be tracked in very specific steps. The first step is you have bare rock. So after that volcano erupted, all you had left around the mountain was bare rock. The first thing that they saw that came back was what is called pioneer species. So these are your moss and your lichens. What they do is they begin to break down the rock, and that decomposition layer helps to create a topsoil. Once you have that topsoil and you have nutrients in there, then you can start to have some small grasses and some small plants grow. Then that gives way to more nutrients in the soil, and you can have larger plants, and eventually, after many, many, many years, you can have what's called a climax community. So you have your larger trees. And think about it, right? We go back to our plants. The types of plants that are in your ecosystem are going to determine the types of animals that are able to live there, because the producers are what provide food for the rest of the food chain. So they are extremely important. So when we look at the key features of primary succession, we have no soil to start. It can take hundreds to thousands of years. And you have pioneer species like lichens and moss. Some examples of primary succession would be volcano, and when we have island formation as well. Ironically, it's also volcanic formation as well. So the Hawaiian Islands, they would be an example of primary succession. All right, so when we look at pioneering species, in case you haven't seen what lichens look like, lichens are actually a symbiotic relationship between a certain type of algae and fungi that live together. So it kind of looks, if you've ever seen them, sometimes they'll grow on trees and also on rocks. So that's lichen, and that's moss. So moss that's a super close-up picture, but moss is just it's very small. And you'll see it maybe on patches of rock very often, or even on patches of soil. Okay, so when we talk about secondary succession, there is slightly less disturbance. You have your soil is left intact, and it doesn't take quite as long typically for your ecosystem to bounce back. So the key features here, soil is there. You have soil. Soil is important because it provides stability for the roots of plants. So when you're a plant, you have roots that go down into the soil. So that way, when it rains, you can absorb the water and the nutrients up through your roots, It also provides stability, so if there's a huge storm, you're not going to get like washed away. So the soil is very important that it is there and it is intact. So that's secondary succession. And it takes a lot less time to recover than primary succession. So whereas primary succession could take, hundreds to even thousands of years, sometimes less. But when we look at secondary succession, to reach the climax community, it can take less than 50 years to recover. So some examples of secondary succession: forest clearing. So sometimes when they are harvesting forests and they just kind of clear cut the whole forest, that can really change the landscape. There are lots of organisms that live at every single level within a forest, and that can really decimate it. They have come up with better foresting practices in the last few decades that have typically avoided forest clearing, like completely chopping down an entire forest. But that is information for a different video. Another example of secondary section is fire. So in recent years, I'm sure you have heard of the decimating fires in California. So it'll be interesting to see whether those continue and whether that could potentially permanently change the landscape. Maybe those fires will become a regular part of the organisms that are able to survive in that area, which could impact humans and where we choose to live. Okay, flood. Flood is another example of secondary succession. Windstorms. If you have like a bunch of trees that get knocked down, that could be, I don't have it here, but farming. So when you are clearing the land for farming, when a few hundred years ago, when we started colonizing across Pennsylvania, we cut down a lot of the forests, just clear cut them to clear it and make way for farming. Pollution and disease as well can have a huge impact and cause secondary succession. It can cause that disturbance that is the ecosystem is going to have to recover from. And the less biodiverse it is, the less ability the ecosystem is going to have to recover, which I think is very important to keep in mind. So that's all for today. I hope you guys were able to catch those Easter eggs. Make sure that you drop them on the assignment sheet and check out my next video on how to complete the assignment for the week of May 26th. Have a great day, guys.